recorded?
Yeah.
You're gonna make us famous?
So my first question is where you two were when the war broke out.
Okay. Well, that's a difficult question because it depends on where you decide that the war broke out. And let me just give you a
Okay.
little background. The American involvement in Vietnam actually started with the America's support of the French in their battle in what was then called Indochina,
Yeah.
which was Vietnam, Cambodia, and then later Laos. And so the U.S. Supported the French in their attempt to retain their colonial empire in Indochina. The French lost there in a famous battle, I think Dien Bien Phu,
Yeah.
and so the Vietnamese won. And then I think the Eisenhower sent in what he called advisors, and he sent in about 900 advisors. Kennedy came along and sent in about 16,000 before he was assassinated,
Yeesh.
and then Johnson, by the height of the war, in around 1968, 1969, he had 500,000 American troops there. But so, roughly speaking, for us, the war started around 1965,
Okay.
something like that. We were both at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana.
Oh. Where is that close to Chicago?
It's 100 miles south of Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that Eisenhower and Kennedy had a bunch of advisors. Were those like political people? Because I remember reading something about that in my American Studies
Yeah.
textbook.
I think they were
But then-
advisors to the South Vietnamese government, and the head of the government then was a man with the name of I think it's Dien. I
Yeah,
can't remember.
something like that,
Dien,
yeah.
right. Very unpopular. Most of Vietnam was Buddhist.
And-
Dien belonged to the Catholic wealthy minority.
Yeah.
And he was very oppressive to the Buddhists and promised land reform, which never came about.
Yeah.
So the peasants were paying high rents to their wealthy landlords, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with him.
Yeah.
And politically, he was very oppressive. He killed thousands of his own people, imprisoned and tortured them. And eventually, he was overthrown and assassinated. He and his brother were killed. But I think the people that the U.S. sent in, Eisenhower and Kennedy, were called advisors. But I think that what they were doing is they were trying to train the South Vietnamese army and advising them on how to
Fight.
fight.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when 1965 came about, like, what were your feelings on the war?
Well, I think that both of us were opposed to it right from the very beginning. It's hard, you're talking about going back over about 50 years now. So, we were very much opposed to the war. Do you remember much about what led to
Well, I
that?
just remember that there were a lot of young people, especially the students who would get drafted, who were very opposed to it because they were the ones that would have to go and fight. So I think on a college campus, there was a lot of unrest and turmoil. And I think that there was a lot of protesting, a lot of activity, riots, and those spread beyond college campuses into cities like Los Angeles and Detroit.
Were any of you involved in those protests?
I don't think we were involved in the protest, but not in a sense in any kind of violent way, just going to rallies and supporting. But I recall, I can't remember what year that was, but the Illinois National Guard was called out and occupied the campus area at the University of Illinois.
Wow.
And I wanted to show you some photographs of a few years later at Kent State in Ohio.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you were familiar with this.
Yeah, the Kent State
Yeah,
shootings.
yes, there were 4 students who were killed by the Ohio National Guard
Yeah.
during an anti-war protest. This was in like April or May of 1970. Indeed, I just went online and there's a famous photograph
Oh, yeah.
of a woman kneeling over a dead student.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to Google and images
Yeah.
and type in Kent State massacre or shooting,
Yeah.
you'll just get page after page of photos.
Yeah.
You'll get a sense of, you'll see the National Guard on the hill
Mm-hmm.
and all that. But it was a time of just great, there was a great division in this country between the people who supported the war and the people who were against it.
Yeah.
And I think, university students and a lot of
Faculty sometimes too.
faculty were against the war. Rural, which you might call rednecks now,
Yeah.
were very much in favor of the war. And there were, as Marilyn said, even in large cities, there were violence erupted between groups of people who were protesting and those who were
Yeah.
against the protesters.
So you mentioned that some of the faculty were also against the war. How popular was that
Well,
among?
I think that there wasn't much unpopularity in our community because the students were already there and their ideas would line up with the same way.
Okay.
Are you asking how popular the
Yeah. So
faculty?
how much of the faculty was against the war?
It's hard to know. What I do recall is there was a kind of a division between faculty who felt it was their responsibility to continue teaching their classes as
Normally.
normal,
Yeah.
and those who felt an obligation, a moral obligation, to diverge from their prescribed curriculum and deal with their students with the war. So there was that split among the faculty as well.
So how would the teachers who felt that it was their duty to diverge from the curriculum teach?
Hard to remember that.
Probably differs from teacher to teacher, depending on the intensity of their feeling, their anti-war feeling.
So if we were talking about like an extreme pacifist, how would that person teach his class?
He might
don't
be
know.
joining the protest as far as marches.
Well, if there were protests and it was during class time, they might allow the students to skip the class and go to the protests and
Okay.
that sort of thing.
All
But that kind of detail is very, very hard to remember at this point. In 50 years, I'm going to ask you about your experiences now.
Who is our favorite
Yes, right.
neighbor?
Yes, that you'll remember.
Yeah. So, like, for some of the major events like Tet Offensive and the My Lai Massacre, like,
Yeah.
what were your feelings when those came
Oh,
out?
outrage.